We are back. We are back and we are talking about getting to my enough with Dr. Marie Brown Mercadel, and I'm Toroshinia Kennedy. And last time we spoke, when we were talking about getting to my enough, we went through like the first 4 chapters. We talked about the first 4 chapters of this fantastic book. If you haven't gotten a copy, you better get it now, so that you can join the discussion and you can follow along, know exactly what we're talking about. But tonight or today, what I'd like to talk about is the next section of the book. So while the first section has like 7 chapters, 8 chapters actually, I'm trying to, sorry, because I tabbed it off differently. Let me see. It was the first 4 chapters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then we talked a little bit about where is she when your mom left the house.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to continue with chapters 5 through 11.
Okay.
I know that's a huge jump, but what I do like about the book, Marie, is that your chapters aren't very long.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's cool since I've been reading along. I know you gave me a copy of the manuscript before it went to print before I got my book.
Mm-hmm.
But after I got my book, I like reading the chapters because they're just so quick to get through.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also think that facilitates our discussions a little better.
Yes.
So starting with chapter 5,
mm-hmm.
it says a new abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
And, wow. I mean, your mom left. Your mom left the household. And that changed everything. It shook things up. Like, talk a little bit about this new abnormal that you and your siblings and your dad were living through.
So hopefully everyone that's listening to this can go back and listen to the first podcast that kind of leads up and talks about the things that happened in the first few chapters. But in case there's someone that's just joining in, talking about my new abnormal, while I was in the throes of the sexual abuse by my older brother, there was an incident of domestic violence between my mom and my dad. I had come back from hanging out with my godparents. I typically hung out with my godparents every Saturday. They came to pick me up and we got ice cream and we watched the ducks in the park, and we always went to the car wash. I always remember that because the beads of the water on the windowsill always comforted me and calmed me. And even now when I go to the car wash, I still relate back to going to the car wash because of that soothing, you got to slow down and wait. You can't do anything until the light turns green and you can move forward. So you have to sit down and just kind of wait. And so I remember coming home after an outing with my godparents, and my mom was sitting at this chair with the mirror in front of her, and she had all these bruises in her face, and my older sister Gwen was helping her tend to her wounds with the ice pack and on her face, and she had bruising on her body. And as a 7-year-old, I'm shocked, like what's happening to my mom. And I'm looking around for my dad, obviously, because the dad is the protector of our family. And he's not there, and I'm asking my mom what happened, what's going on. And everyone's upset. My older sister is helping her, she's upset. 2 of my other siblings came in and they're upset, and I'm running around trying to figure out where is my daddy, because he's going to take care of this. Like, whoever hurt my mom, he's going to take care of it. And so we went on about our day. My mom went to go in and lay down. She was still very upset and crying, and my younger brother and I went and lay down in the bed with her, and we didn't know what was going on. My younger brother was a toddler, and so toddlers don't really understand, but you can sense the energy, right? Because I remember, hugging my mom and my brother hugging me. It's like we held on so tightly. And my sister kept coming back and forth inside the room, to check on my mom and everything. And eventually we fell asleep. I realized that my dad came back into the house later on in the evening, but he stayed out of the room. He didn't come back in the room. So the next day was Sunday, and things were really, really, tense and not typical, because there were 7 of us, and there's not enough space for 7 people in an 800 square foot house. And so everyone's running around and laughing and talking typically, but not that day. The air was very, very thick. And so fast forward to Monday, I'm getting up and getting ready to go to school just like any other day, getting my stuff ready. My siblings are out and about, and my dad left for work on time, but my mom, wasn't at work that particular morning. I gave her a hug and I went about my day to go to school. So my mom worked part-time as a waitress and part-time as a bus driver. So sometimes she did both on one day and sometimes she alternated her schedule. So I expected her to not be home when I got home from school because her waitressing job was typically in the evenings and she would come home around, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock some days. And so I remember asking my sister what time she would be home from work, and my sister didn't really respond to that. And I laid on the couch waiting for her to come home because I was used to my mom, tucking me in, every night. And I smile when I think about that because my granddaughter, Brooklyn, who's 11, wants to be tucked in every night. I wonder how long that's going to last with her. Hopefully forever, because I enjoy doing it when she's here. But that night, we fell asleep on the couch, my brother and I, and eventually my sister put us to bed. I woke up the next morning, she wasn't there. So I remember repeating that ritual, running home from school, hoping that she was going to be there when I got home, waking up in the morning, going to look for her. And it took me about 2 weeks to realize that she was gone and that she wasn't coming back. And it would be 2 years before I would see her again because she moved to California. I had never heard my parents argue before, raise their voices. I had never seen any fight or anything. But what I learned later is that there were other incidences of domestic violence, but there was nothing that I ever saw. And so my new abnormal was, being raised in a household by my dad, there with my 6 siblings. And obviously in the 70s, it was pretty much of an anomaly for a dad to be a single parent. Still today, I would say it is too, to an extent, because typically it's the dad that leaves the household and the mom is the one that's there, being the single mom, and the dad has visitation, maybe, if it's an active dad. But so that was pretty much abnormal. It was my new abnormal because it was abnormal for me because my mom, wasn't there. And as a 7-year-old, I'm not really understanding the dynamics of why she wasn't there. And not at 7 years old, I don't know where California is. I'm in North Carolina. I don't know geographically that she's 3,000 miles away. And so it was a huge adjustment for me.
What's so interesting, because going back to our first discussion, our first episode of this podcast, when we talked about, the family history, the Browns and your father and having been abandoned as a child. And then I just imagine how really just like sobering and at the same time probably a little depressing for him to have to see his own children go through that, and knowing that part of it was because of his actions. So I know in the book you never address like what was the cause of it, and there were several other things where they weren't discussed. So did your dad ever discuss that incident with you or with your siblings?
We never talked about it. And, one of the things that I mentioned earlier in the Meet the Brown section is that my mom was 16 years old when she married my dad. He was 28. And again, that was not atypical for those times when young girls got married at 14, 15, 16, and had, babies and babies and babies. My dad had 12 siblings. So that wasn't abnormal, but my dad never talked about that. And I think that, and a lot of it is, I'm speculating about much of these things from what I was able to observe and glean from understanding more about their backgrounds, in the past few years, is that my mom was 31 years old and she had 7 children.
Wow.
So between the ages of 15 and 31, she gave birth to 7 children. And remember, my dad had a military career in which he retired from the military career. My mom hadn't had a career per se. And so she had a high school education, but she was waitressing and she was also driving a bus. Later on, she became a registered nurse. So I could imagine that she was not fulfilled in being a waitress and in being a bus driver, although There's nothing wrong with either of those professions. I think she wanted more, and I really felt like she was overwhelmed
Mm-hmm.
and felt stuck, in a way. And it might sound like I'm trying to make excuses for both my mom and my dad, and I'm not making excuses because they are very much responsible for their own actions and their own behaviors. Because my mom leaving had a devastating impact on not only me, but all of my siblings. But my dad was a guy,
Mm-hmm.
and not a communicative guy at that. And so we never sat down and addressed, well, your mom's not coming back, and this is what happened, and this is why. And my mom never said to us, I'm not coming back, and this is what happened, and this is why. We just kind of moved through, the motions of realizing that this is how we were going to have to live. And all of us, all of my siblings, we were all really trying to figure it out. And I really believe that because my dad had been abandoned as a child, that regardless of what the issues were between him and my mother, he was not going to abandon his children because he could have. We could have all ended up in the foster care system,
Yeah.
very separated, because typically most foster families are not going to take seven, children. We didn't have any family in North Carolina. All of my extended family lived in Georgia and still do. So the circle in Jacksonville was very, very small. And so I think that my dad was intent on keeping us, together, and with him. And that's what he did.
Well, and it's interesting when you talk about your dad not being very communicative
Hmm.
during the start and all the months and years after
Hmm.
that development, that event between your mom and your dad. Um, but it was interesting that your mother never spoke about it,
Hmm.
because one of the things that I've observed among, when I was growing up with friends, is that sometimes you'd have a falling out between the parents. And I know in your book you talk about you were a minority in that instance, that all the kids in your neighborhood and the kids that you knew from school had mom
Hmm.
and dad in the household, and you were one of the few at
Hmm.
that time who only had one parent in the
Hmm.
household. But oftentimes, and I'm sure you witnessed this with people whose family lives, the parents, the marriage ended, and you'd have one parent sort of badmouth the other.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
your mother never did that.
No.
I mean, that's amazing. That says a lot about her.
My mother never did that, nor did my dad ever do that either. And so, in fact, I don't know how long it took for them, but maybe about a year or so. I think they established, lines of communication. I think my dad likely initially thought that, oh, where's she going? She doesn't really have any money. She's going to be back. But apparently, she had a network, and she got to California and got herself settled with, a job, an apartment, and a car, and then she started going to nursing school. And so they kept the lines of communication open. In fact, I think people are shocked to know that they never divorced,
Yeah.
never divorced. And their relationship was such that they talked very frequently. My mom wanted to be engaged in the things that were happening in our daily lives, albeit from 3,000 miles away. And my mom even came back to stay with us for like a month, every year, and at different times, of the year. And when she came, she slept in one of the girls' rooms, so they were never intimate again after she left, but they always maintained a very family like relationship, even to the extent I never saw my dad with any other females, never brought any other woman to the house, never had any other females around any of us ever.
That is very surprising. But
Mhm.
then that also says that he was really committed to focusing on you children, and not introducing anything that might upset your home life any
Right.
further. But when you talked about your mom and your dad having this, finally developing the lines of communication again, having a decent rapport, all to benefit the family. When after the new abnormal from
Mhm.
chapter 5, you go into chapter 6.
Mhm.
You talk to about the pretending, the pretending that you're a real family. So, a few minutes ago, you talked about when your mom would come to visit, she'd
Mm-hmm.
sleep in one of the girls' rooms. Your parents were never intimate, yet they were 4 weeks at a time living under the same roof. And
Mm-hmm.
for outer appearances, look like you guys were a whole family. So, I mean, that let's pretend we are a real family. How has that impacted you in terms of like your ability to put on pretenses in term when there's stressful situations, like maybe at work when you have to pretend like things aren't going south, or you're not upset with someone, or even in your personal life, your other relationships? Can you
Mm-hmm.
tell me a little bit about that?
Well, it's like I was saying, let's pretend, we're a real family. We knew that for 30 days out of the year, we were going to be an intact family, right? If my mom came during the school year, she was going to go to teacher parent conferences, or if there were anything happening at school, she was going to be engaged in that. If it was not within the school year, because she had to manipulate her schedule with her, employer
Mhm.
around that time, then we were going to go on outings, and she was going to cook the same type of large meals that she would normally cook. And we were all clamoring for that 4 weeks of time. And we went through this ritual that I ended up resenting over time of cleaning the house spotless, spick and span, picking all the weeds from around the fence, and everything presented like it was just so great. The house was already clean in the first place because my dad was in the military. There was no such thing. We didn't leave dishes in the sink. We didn't put pasta pan in the refrigerator. And I have absorbed that, and I don't do any of those things either now to this day. As soon as I hit my feet hit the floor in the morning, I make up my bed. So all of it wasn't that I brought with me today isn't bad, but it was just a manifestation of what I learned during this time.
Yes.
So I felt really good for those 4 weeks out of the year. And then I had to, start the timeline all over again and be waiting and waiting and waiting. But it taught me how to, I think it really prepared me in some ways for some of my executive roles that I would have to go in and talk myself into, okay, breathe, put this face on, turn it on.
Mhm.
Turn it on. When you get out of this car to go to this meeting, turn it on. No matter how you feel, no matter what you're going through, no matter how you feel about the people you're meeting with or the subject of the meeting, you're going to turn it on. And then when you get out of here, you can turn it off. And I think that really prepared me for turning things on and off in many situations in my life, and masking and pretending that things were okay when I really was not okay.
Right. And I don't want to jump ahead and because you also mask and pretend like things are okay
Mm-hmm.
later on in the we'll get to that chapter when you're reunited with your mom and you're living under the same roof.
Yes.
But I it struck me that not only was the entire family putting on this face of that we are a real family, you had the secret burden, very painful burden of putting on another face. So
Mm-hmm.
you actually wore three faces.
Yes.
The Marie that you would show to your classmates and your teachers
Mhm,
and neighborhood kids. And then you
mhm.
had the face that when your mom was visiting, that you shared with your siblings, that hey, there's no undercurrent of any problems, everything's okay, we're all good. And then the unfortunate face, the mask that you had to wear when you were
Mhm.
around this perpetrator, this person who
Yes.
was harming you. So you
Mhm.
had to put that on. And while it benefited you in the future, being able to have more of a calm demeanor in times of stress in the workplace or in other times, I just feel like, gee, that's so much for a child to have taken on.
Oh, absolutely. Because every year before my mom came home, I really during the time that I was being abused, I really rehearsed in my head that I was going to tell her when she got home.
Mhm.
I was going to tell her, and then she was going to pack up all my clothes, and we were going to go back to California together. And then I was going to be, away from the abuse and all that. But then I was like, well, if I tell her now, because my brother warned me not to tell her, right? And that's what perpetrators do. They
Yeah.
threaten. If you tell, you're gonna get this is gonna happen to you, or if you tell, I'm gonna hurt somebody, or those kind of things. And so I knew that if I said anything to her, then that would ruin it for everybody.
Yeah.
And so that was my introduction into making sure everybody was okay first before me.
Mhm. Being
I
agreeable.
spent a lot, well, not necessarily being agreeable, because I don't
Mhm.
think anybody would ever accuse me of being agreeable. Um, but it was more so putting everybody else's needs first.
Mhm.
Did that for a long time in my life. Like, for many, many years in my life, I'd get up in the morning and the first thing that I did was not for me. It was for
Yes.
someone else. It was going
Mhm.
to be for my daughter, my husband, my nieces, nephews, sisters, my job. It was going to be for someone else, but it wasn't going to be for me. And I
Mhm.
think that was the beginning of that, is thinking, if I tell her while she's here, this is going to blow all to hell. And then everybody else's visit is going to be ruined. And then what's going to happen is she going to get angry. And then is she never going to come back? And then everybody's perhaps going to blame me because I told her this thing and now it ruined it for everybody. So I'm rationalizing from the mind of a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old and a 9-year-old. No, you don't have real critical thinking, when you're in
Right.
a timeline, but I knew enough to know that I didn't want to ruin it for anybody else. So I put myself and my own needs in the background.
But you did tell. You told someone.
I did tell
It
someone.
wasn't, it wasn't that you had a plan to tell someone.
Right.
It
Right.
was like it was almost I don't know if I should, it was just you had a knee jerk,
It was
not
by
knee jerk.
accident.
It
It
was
was by accident.
compulsory, it was by
Yeah.
accident
Yeah.
because the
Yeah.
stress. I mean, you didn't even know what you were doing, like
Right.
when you said it. So,
Right.
I'm getting to chapter 7, and the I oh my gosh, it just oh woo, that was I just wanted to hug baby little Marie when I
Mhm.
was reading this because the
Little
moment
Marie
you
got a lot of hugs this weekend at the Sipping Hills. Little Marie got a lot of hugs. I got a
yeah,
lot of hugs. Yeah.
because like the moment those words came out of your mouth, you wanted to
Mhm.
put them back in.
Mhm.
I mean, like,
You want to read the passage?
yeah, I'm looking at it, and um it's you're talking about you're going and you're playing with some after school.
Mhm.
You would stay with Mrs. Betty, and
Mhm.
Mrs. Betty had children, and you would play with her children, and just like kids do, and like they're kids who are similar in age range,
Mhm.
but there's a 13-year-old boy who's the son of Mrs. Betty, and she has, I think, two daughters,
Great.
and you guys are playing, and like kids often do, they would play grown up, so we're going to play grown ups, we're going to play family, and you pretend that you had a boyfriend, and then at one point, in complete and total innocence, this her son has no idea, and you guys are playing this game, and here's it reads, once the game began, Jonathan cupped my face in his hands and tried to kiss me. Yuck! I proclaimed and pushed him away from me. Don't do that. My brother Edward does that to me. He always takes off my clothes. I'm like reading that, and I went, whew, and I'm thinking I would have had the same response as your playmate.
Mhm.
Jonathan's sister, who she hears that and she immediately runs to her mom,
Yes. Mhm.
because I was raised with the boys play with boys, girls play with girls, and
Mhm.
don't ever let anybody touch you in your private parts or in any
Mhm.
inappropriate way that you don't want, and
Mhm.
make sure that you tell your parents.
Mhm.
My mom and my stepfather and my older siblings were always the safe people. So I knew if
Mhm.
anything were to happen to me. And I feel so bad. It's because you didn't have that opportunity because you wanted. It's not that you couldn't tell your sister Gwen, because obviously she was trusted, but you didn't want to ruin the
Right.
pretend when mom came. You
Right.
didn't want to, and then it slipped out, and it slipped out in a way that you could never put it back in.
Right.
Wow.
Right. And honestly, as you said, that was kind of, I didn't, that wasn't a disclosure.
Yeah.
That was an accident.
Yeah.
Um, so, when she went in and told her mom, my dad came to pick me up. Obviously, she told my dad, and, when he asked me about it, when he asked me, um, had Edward been touching me? And I said yes. And he asked me for how long, and I told him. And so my dad really had skin like Hershey's chocolate, but on this day, he looked like 2 or 3 shades lighter, like almost ashen. I had never seen him look this way before.
Wow.
And so, he took my hand, and I was so happy that I wasn't getting a whipping, because that's what Edward told me, that if I told anybody that I was going to get a whipping. So that's why I
Yeah.
didn't tell anybody, because who wants a whipping? Because back in the day, I didn't get whippings, but I witnessed my siblings get whippings. They go get their own sticks off the trees, and
Oh yeah.
who wants a whipping? Okay. Sometimes it was on bare legs.
Yes.
And so I just remember getting in the car, and, I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes and pretended that I was asleep. The ride was about 25 minutes home. And I remember getting home, and, my dad took Edward, and they talked in the back room. And the next day, Edward was gone. And so I assumed that him and my mom had a conversation, because my dad and I never spoke of this again.
Mm.
Never spoke of it again. Never had a conversation.
Wow.
And it took me, I don't know, 15 years or more to realize that my dad never told my mom about the molestation, because when I brought it up to her in my early 20s, she was very, very shocked and surprised and very, very upset. But not reactive to the point that she addressed it either, but very
Yeah.
upset. Mm-hmm.
You know, yeah, I can understand that maybe for not reacting, not to say that. I mean, because this is her child. You were her child, and you were telling her something horrible about her
About the
other child.
right. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
but going back to when you talked about, after your dad, you told your playmate. She tells Mrs. Betty. Mrs. Betty tells your dad. You and your dad don't talk about it, but your dad handled it. He,
Yes.
Edward's out of the house, and so you have this what seems like a reprieve,
Mm-hmm.
but something else happens to just like make life a little more challenging for little Marie. And
Mm-hmm.
this is with school. I mean, you were bullied. I mean, we talk about it nowadays as
Mm-hmm.
if like it's something that is only happening in the new millennium, but
Yeah,
it was happening decades ago when we were all kids. And you survived childhood trauma at the hands of your classmates. I
absolutely.
Yeah.
So when I was early on in elementary school, maybe I was 9 around the time that my dad, we outgrew the rental house that we were living in. So he got a loan and had us a house built from the ground up in another part of town, which would require me to change schools. At the school that I was going to, when we lived in our rental house, I had, relationships, and the little girls that I would walk to school with. It's interesting because I'm still in communication with them today. And so, I had relationships at that school, but I moved to a new school in a new area. And many people didn't move to that area unless they were military, but most people grew up together. Almost everybody was related to somebody that went to that school. So I was an outsider there. And so the new kid at school, right? So people want to try the new kid at school, or people, you have to get into the cliques. So I had maybe 1 or 2 friends at school, and one of my friends, we were friends within the 2 classes that we were in, but when we were outside those classes, she was with her cousins, and they weren't friendly to me. And there was a small group of girls who used to, throw spitballs at my head and call me skinny and ugly and all of these things. And so in the midst of all this other turmoil with the molestation and not having my mother, and, just kind of trying to find my place, it was very traumatizing, to have to go through that, and have to deal with that, because I felt so very much alone. And the interesting carryover to that for me is traveling around the country with my husband in his military career and going into new work environments. When I went to the county of San Diego, many people I work with had been there for years and years, right? Grew up in the county of San Diego. So here I am coming as an outsider with these outside thoughts and these outside ways of doing things. And, so that was my scenario there, and having to eventually over time be able to embed myself into the culture and be successful there as an executive, but still feeling to an extent like an outsider as well. So I really felt that way in much of my professional career because I'm going into organizations that have old timers, if you will,
Yeah.
and have tenured, people who have worked at the county their whole entire life. So then here I come, and so I felt that sense of I'm that sense of being an outsider. I think followed me from these instances as a child all the way through my work career, oddly. But it was very difficult because it was very isolating. And so I
Yeah.
found ways to try to avoid the bullying by becoming an avid reader. I mean, I
Well,
read.
it just broke my heart though, because when I look in the back of your book and you have the photos
Mhm.
and I see little Marie, you
Yes.
know, little Marie, she's so young and so skinny. I mean, you're a tiny woman, but you've got some might. You work out regularly, so you got some might. But I think about, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old Marie,
Mhm.
this little beanpole who wasn't very tall to begin with, and then just super skinny, and but being so strong, having the resilience and the might of like a giant,
Mm.
to go through, endure the shift in your family dynamics, then being molested by a family member, and then changing schools, and so you don't get to see your clique, your friends every day. We all have had our cliques. Well, I shouldn't say we all, but a lot of
Mhm.
us have had that experience, and we
Mhm.
love it. We love being. I have my OGs,
Mhm.
and then going to school and then being tormented. And it's funny because I think about your brother, the perpetrator,
Mhm.
and you and I have talked about this in different conversations. You saw it. Somebody must have had to have done something to him for him to learn that behavior. But
Yeah.
then I think about the mean girls. Where
Yeah.
did they learn that? What
Mhm.
made them want to be mean? Because
Mhm.
your size, you think people would just want to come up and embrace you, this
Mhm.
fragile young little girl.
Mhm.
So, did you ever speculate about that with those mean girls? What was driving that behavior?
I think with bullies, really, it's just really about power and power and control, and it's people who are different from them. So for me, being the being different part was one in my mind at the time. I didn't have a mom living with me, and two, I wasn't from there, so I didn't have those connections. Most of the people that I grew up with, they had those connections. They were related to somebody. They grew up there. They extended family members. They went to elementary school together. Then they went to junior high together. Then they went to high school together, because in our neighborhoods you went to one middle school, one elementary school, one middle school, so they were all together. And I probably, my self-esteem was probably very, very low. I probably didn't carry myself. People find it very surprising to know that I was bullied back then. I
Mm-hmm.
have to remind them that that was back then. Today is a different time frame. And
Yeah, that wouldn't happen today.
probably found my voice probably somewhere around the time when maybe I was in a freshman in high school, and just kind of push back. It's crazy because it only took one time for me to say, listen, I'm not going to let you do this to me today, and just kind of fight back. It
Mm-hmm.
took one time
Yeah.
for that to end. But when you're 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, and you already have a small circle to begin with. I never even thought about telling my siblings. I could have told my siblings, but I never even thought about that as being an option, really, because I was going to school every single day with a full load on my back,
Mm-hmm.
invisible amount of stress in my book bag anyway.
Yeah. Which for me, it just goes back to the whole, you having to wear these different faces
Yes.
wherever you went. And, it's challenging enough for an adult who has to do it in
Mm-hmm.
one or two circumstances, and justifiably, like in the workplace, when you've got to be the person to get morale boosted when
Mm-hmm.
staff are in the dumps. And so you have to put on the brave face, or, help motivate them and inspire them. And we can justify that, but it's challenging, even
Yes.
just that type of
Mm-hmm.
circumstance. But for a
Mm-hmm.
young child, and all the faces you had to wear, and
Mm-hmm.
that just, really, it just made my heart tighten up, almost like a little vice was put on it when I was reading that. and I'm getting a little choked up right now just talking about it, especially because at the start of every chapter, I love the fact that you have an inspirational quote or a biblical verse that
Mhm.
somehow relates to what is being
Mhm.
expressed in the chapter. And when it comes to chapter 8, which is called Friends Anyone, when you're talking about this bullying, um, you said, "Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted." That's Psalm 25, verse 16. And do you think it was at that time, or maybe was it earlier, that you feel like you became more spiritual and more aware of God's grace and protection?
Honestly, I wasn't even thinking about it from a spiritual realm at that time.
Mhm.
I was really just thinking about how can I move from one day to the next? How
Survival.
can I just survive? How can I was so happy on Fridays because I knew I didn't have to deal with these people for 2 more days.
Yeah.
And some people experience this when they're getting ready to go to work on Monday morning, is that on Sunday they start to feel just stressed and tightening of the chest and all that. I felt that on Sundays when I had to go back to school
Wow.
because it wasn't a safe place for me in terms of my emotions. It's kind of a double-edged sword though, because I was lonely, I read more. And because I read more, I was smarter. And because I was smarter, I got good grades. And because I got good grades, I was often exempt from exams and those types of things. And so, I was striving. I was still always striving there. Well, if I can't be, good at having friends or, that kind of thing, I can be good in something. And, I just found ways to try to isolate the pain, that I was feeling, and to try to avoid situations. So during lunchtime, I didn't have anybody to eat with, so I would go to the library,
Mm.
read.
I loved the library at that age. Oh my gosh.
Mhm,
I
mhm,
wouldn't call myself a voracious reader, but yes, there's something about um, the solitude of
mhm,
being in a library as a youth, and
mhm,
um, even as an adult. I love libraries, but it's just
mhm.
I love the fact how you knew where to go to a place that would
I could be
help
safe
you.
at the library because the people who were
Yeah,
picking on me were not going to the library.
yeah. But then also being in the library paid off because
Yes.
you ended up getting some really good grades,
Right.
and but
Exactly.
you know, and that helped you. But
Mhm,
you were still, in some ways, even though you were doing very well in school,
mhm,
you were still a young person, and you still
mhm.
had some naivety.
Yes.
And
Mhm,
that naivety showed itself when you met a young man,
mhm.
when I believe it was Kenneth.
Yes, get it.
So, talk about how that naivety showed itself, how it manifested.
Mhm. So, being a teenager, I had such a tumultuous time between the ages of 7 and 14 because when I turned 13 and a half or 14, Edward came back to the house. And I learned later that he had went away to a job training program in another state, and that's where he had been. And he came back to the house, and my sense of safety really just kind of shattered because there he was again. And I couldn't understand why my dad allowed him to come back to the house. Like, why did he believe that it was going to be okay?
Yeah.
I was angry and I was baffled. And when he tried to accost me again, now I had a voice by this time, as I told you. I started
Hmm.
a voice around this time. I wasn't going to be bullied anymore. I was over that. I wasn't going to let him touch me anymore. And I just said, you need to leave me alone or I'm going to tell. And plus, my menstrual cycle started coming on around that time too. So I think he knew enough to leave me alone because I would have told at that point. Now, mind
Yes.
you, I still had never had a conversation with my mom about the molestation, and so in my mind, she knew, but in reality, she didn't know. But I still told him to leave me alone or I would tell. And so I tried to find ways to just stay out of the house, aside from, being in school and being away from school and being away from home when I was in school. I needed to figure out a way to be away from home on the weekends too, because he was home on the weekends and I just felt this uneasiness being around him. And so I started hanging around with a young boy named Kenneth, and I wasn't allowed to have a boyfriend. And so mentally, I think I was older than a 14-year-old because of all of the mental gymnastics that I had to play in my mind to make it and to survive.
Yeah.
And so I started hanging around with Kenneth, and I was a candy striper at the hospital and volunteered to be to work. You know, most of my shifts were on the weekends because that's when would have transportation to get back and forth to the hospital. So I started manipulating my shifts. So maybe I was told my dad or my sister that I was going to get off at 7, but in reality, I got up at maybe 4. And then Kenneth and I would go to his mom's house, and she would be at work most of the times. And even if she was home, she either didn't care or was oblivious to what we were doing in the room.
Mm.
And so after a few months of having sex, I missed my cycle, and I knew enough about sex to know that I was pregnant.
So, you know, yeah, I mean, your relationship with Kenneth, it's it just shocked me because when I was reading that chapter in the book, because you know, you you were sexually traumatized by
Mhm,
your brother,
mhm,
yet you were willing to have a sexual relationship with Kenneth.
mhm,
So again, you used the word mental gymnastics, and
mhm,
I had been talking about you wearing these different masks.
mhm.
So do you think you were wearing any masks in your interactions with Kenneth, or were you able to really be legitimately be yourself?
No, I wanted to feel loved.
Mhm.
I was lonely, and I wanted to feel loved. And one of the things that typically that can happen to someone who's sexually abused is that they can use sex as an outlet. They can become promiscuous.
Mhm.
So if you're abused, you know, those behaviors can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. And so, you know, I wanted to feel loved. I wanted to feel like someone cared about me, and I felt like Kenneth cared about me, and I felt like he loved me. Um, you know, for however much you can have like real love at 15, that's what I felt. And so, you know, having sex with him was a natural progression because I had already had sex. I mean, you know, I was no longer a virgin at age 7. And so, you know, having sex with him, it made me feel it made me feel like someone cared about me. It
Mhm.
made me feel like someone loved me. So that's why I was really, you know, clinging, you know, to him and to, you know, being able to spend time with him. We didn't have sex every time we were together, but we obviously had enough sex, you know, for me to be pregnant. But I felt I felt like I had someone who cared about me, who wanted to know about, you know, who I was. So I was there was a comfort there, and so that natural progression was, you know, the exploration of sex.
And when you talk about, finding out that you were pregnant, well, actually, your sister
Hmm.
Gwen confronting you because you would attempted at just hiding, praying
Hmm.
away, ignoring your pregnancy, which we all know that wasn't going to work.
Hmm.
But then when your sister Gwen confronts you at school and it's decided for you that the pregnancy would be terminated,
Hmm.
um, did you also feel like, there goes your chance for someone else to love you and accept you?
Well, I never imagined doing anything else except having a baby
Mhm.
when I was found that I was pregnant. I just didn't know how I was going to take care of a baby. But the thought of having an abortion wasn't something that I even considered. I just figured, okay, well, I have a baby, I'll figure it out. I'll still go to school. Maybe I have to find a job at McDonald's or something. But but I would love this child, and this child would love me. And in my magical mind, Kenneth and I and this child were going to be a family. So that magical thinking that you think as a 15-year-old, and we're going to get a job, and then eventually we're going to get a school, and we're going to get married, and we're going to it was all of that magical thinking that I had when that happened. I wasn't trying to get pregnant, but obviously I'm too naive to use condoms, which were readily available. And so I just wasn't thinking long term like most teenagers do, even to this day, that are having sex,
Mhm.
or even adults. We know what it takes to not get pregnant, but yet, we still have these unintended pregnancies anyway. I think I wasn't really thinking about long term at that time, but once I found out I was pregnant, I just assumed that I was going to have a baby, and Kenneth and I were going to be together, and we were going to raise our family and go through this beautiful life. And I was going to have a mom, and I was going to have a dad, and I was going to have my baby.
So he sort of like the chapter, Kenneth just kind of pops in and pops out of your life.
Well,
Um,
not by choice.
mhm.
He really, really wanted to be part of it, but my dad would have no parts of that. And people knew my dad in the community, and people didn't really mess around with my dad.
Mhm.
So if he said you're not coming over, you don't have any say in this, and that really was what was going to happen. And so my dad had reputation, my dad had capacity, and it wasn't for him not trying, because he really was trying. But again, he's a 15-year-old. His mom, not really engaged, I would say, not really concerned one way or the other. But there was not a lot that Kenneth could do, and I was no longer allowed to see him. At one point, I thought that the ties would be loosened a little bit, but they weren't. So it became very difficult, and I would still see him at school, but eventually, um, that ended because I ended up moving to California at the end of that school year anyway. So that pretty much put that distance between the two of us. Again, he was a 15-year-old child, just like I was.
So again, you have another new abnormal.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's not talk about it.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
adults making decisions that are deeply impacting children,
Yes.
but not having thorough conversations about it. I mean, I can imagine that would be a challenging conversation for any parent to have with their child to talk about abortion. But the fact is that they were aware. They had helped make the decision with Gwen to have you go through this. So,
Hmm.
and then also to remove Kenneth from your life,
Hmm.
to cut off communication outside of school. So
Hmm.
again, you have this other new normal, and then moving again from
Hmm.
from one school setting to another school setting, and but this time your new normal had some like shining moments. I mean, with you had new relationships. You moved to Rialto, California, and you meet some. That's in San Bernardino County, is it?
That in San Bernardino County, yes. Hmm.
Yeah, and then so you meet some people and diverse backgrounds, and no people, no bullies.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Hmm.
but then again, you're new abnormal. You're living underneath the same roof. So this is chapter 11, California bound. You're living with your mom. You wanted your little brother Patrick to go with you, but for some reason he stays with the rest of the family in North Carolina, and it's just you, little
Hmm.
Marie, who moves to California to be with her mom, the thing you had wanted so much over the years,
Hmm.
but now it's an awkward reality.
Hmm.
So let's talk about that, like, because before you had said, when you were talking about Kenneth, you saying you were no longer a little girl, you were matured in some ways since you were no longer a virgin. You'd been exposed to things before, that was really before your time. But
Hmm.
then now you're with your mom. So how did that like dream of being reunited of your mom have sort of a shaky start or shaky moments?
So my mom had been trying to get my dad to allow at least myself and my younger brother Patrick to move to California for years once she got stabilized. But he was not going to allow that to happen. He wanted us to stay together. We were all going to be together or not. But after the pregnancy and after the abortion, I think he realized that I needed to be with my mother, that I needed to, or he wanted me to be in a different environment because, like most parents, my dad wanted me to be able to succeed. He knew that I was smart. I was troubled, but he knew that I was smart. And by this time, my sister that was nearest to me, my sister Mary, she was out of the she was living in New York. And so Patrick and I were the only minors, if you will. Everyone else was of age. Mary's 6 years older than me. Glenn's 10 years older than me. Then my siblings in between are anywhere between 7 and 9 years older than me. So Patrick and I were the only minors in the house. And my mom tried so hard to get my dad to allow myself and my younger brother. And I know that my younger brother wanted to come too, but my dad would not allow that. So moving to California was something I always fantasized about. Being in California, with my mom, and who doesn't want to be in California? All Hollywood, all the TV and movie, you envision all these things in your mind. But when it finally happened, it was a huge adjustment. I hadn't lived with my mom by that time in 7 or 8 years, and I wasn't the 7-year-old little girl that she left behind, because I had been through the molestation, which I was already dealing with even when she was in the house, the molestation, and then getting pregnant, having the abortion, which was difficult because I gave birth to a baby and I held that baby in my arms, a stillborn baby in my arms, being bullied, all of that. And so I think she thought she was getting like a 14-year-old little girl, but she really wasn't, because I was so psychologically damaged at that time. And still, the emotional feelings and pain that I carried from that abortion was still new in my mind, because I had no idea that how that it was going to happen the way it happened. I had no idea. And then to go through that and to be alone, because keep in mind, my sister dropped me off at the hospital. So I was dealing with all of that trauma and all of that pain. And so my relationship with my mom was not what I envisioned in my mind, because there was not an acknowledgement of what I had dealt with. She didn't know about the molestation, but she knew about the abortion, and she knew what I had to go through to have the abortion. So there weren't those conversations, and there was not that communication. I needed first of all, I needed her to tell me why she left. I needed her to
Right.
tell me that I'm sorry that you had to go through that abortion. I'm sorry. I needed her to say all these things, but there were not those conversations. It was okay, you're here. She was made it very comfortable for me. I had a nice room. I had nice clothes. I eventually had a car because my mom was doing really well at the time, because by that time she had graduated from nursing school. So I had all those things, but what I needed from her was that communication about what happened to me. But
Mhm.
there was not that communication. And it really took me years and years and years of reflection and self-talk and my own experiences with life and work and education and all that to really be able to reconcile that resentment that I held from her for her, more so for the resentment that I held for my dad, because I understood later on, after learning about their background and how they were raised and the things that happened, multi-generational dysfunction that really shaped the way my parents were parenting us, or just kind of some of the own things that they were carrying. So at that time, I didn't understand it. So I was still like really resentful. I was there, but mentally I was only half there, if that makes sense. Physically, I was there, obviously, but mentally, I was only half there because I was still so broken on the inside.
So, we hear about boys needing their fathers. I mean,
Yes.
knowing that Patrick wasn't allowed to go to California and he was young. He like three or 4 years younger than you. So,
So
yeah, so
when I was 10 or 11.
yeah. So in my mind, that kind of makes sense. But I kind of had an aha moment um, just now about your mother. Even though she didn't communicate, she was similar to your dad. They sort of kept things in.
Mhm.
Um, that maybe she finally was able to convince your father to have you go to California because a girl needs her mother, whether or
Mhm.
not her mother is a good communicator, and
Mhm.
especially after you having gone through the
Mhm.
the unexpected pregnancy and
Mhm.
then the abortion, which led to you having a stillborn baby. Um,
Mhm.
I think in my mind, without knowing your mother, but having read the book and the information you share, that maybe that was her way of trying to have a girl be with her mom and trying to unravel some of the complex knotted existence that occurred in your family after her departure when you were 7.
Yeah, the only challenge, or one of the main challenges, though, is that I left all my siblings behind.
Yeah.
My sisters that had been, even though, when you're a teenager and you have sisters and girls and women living together, you're not necessarily in love with each other at the time. But those were my sisters, and I left them. And I had a guilt that I felt because I left my little brother. I didn't want to leave without my little brother. He was annoying as I don't know what as a little brother, but I didn't want to leave my little brother. And I didn't want to leave my sisters either. I felt a guilt that why am I the one that gets to come and live here when I know that they would have wanted to come and live with her, even though they were adults and living their own lives at that time. Like I said, my sister Mary was living in New York. But still I felt a guilt because I was away from my siblings, and that's who I had been around and spent time with, and so it was just me and her, and that was another part of it too, is they weren't getting to experience being with her every day, like I was, and so that was very painful. I think that was probably, this is going to sound crazy, but that was probably the most painful component for me, was that
Mm-hmm.
there without my sisters and my brother, and because my other brother was out of the house and in the army at that time. I left them. I felt like I left them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So California, I mean, that was part of the emotional downside of moving to California. But one of the higher moments of California is the fact that, yes, you have this high school experience where you're
Mhm.
making friends, people aren't bullying you,
Mhm.
and you had the opportunity to graduate from high school early. I
Yeah.
mean, that sort of set the tone for you, this lover of higher education, this lover of reading. I mean, did that boost your self-confidence? Because I'm sure at that time you were still reeling from some of the the trauma from back in North Carolina, but graduating from high school early, how did that affect your sense of self-worth?
So, what I learned to do was redirect the negative aspects of what was happening in my life into something positive. And so learning that I was going to graduate from high school early, and being exempt from exams and all these things, and I had been exempt from exams, even in high school, and um, so I learned that I could redirect my pain to something else that could bring me joy, or also could help distract me from what was happening in my life. And so that's how I learned, to do that. That's how I always ended up going to school full time and working full time and graduating with honors and all that. That was a source of pride in something for me that let me know that I really that I was worthy, I guess, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and being in California, and I still have some relationships with people that I made friendships with, back in 1980, 81, 82. Obviously, I just moved from California to North Carolina within the last year and a half, and so maintaining some of those relationships that were so critical to me, understanding that bullying and all that was not about me, it was about those people, because I learned that yes, I was likable, and that I could be a friend to someone, and someone could be a friend to me, and that I could actually build those relationships, because the atmosphere was just different, the environment was just different. You live in California, obviously the environment and the culture is night and day between East Coast and West Coast. And so I have some very fond memories of being at Eisenhower High School in Rialto, and some of the friendships that I made there, and some of the successes that I had in school, and being able to graduate early. And when I graduated, I was a certified nurse's assistant, and so I'm very happy that I got to experience the upside of the high school experience. Going to the games and going to the prom and going to I don't know. Did you go to high school in California?
Oh yeah, I'm a native Californian.
Did you guys go to your senior trip at Disney
Grad
World?
night.
Grad
Grad
night.
night. Yes.
So having those experiences and all those things, really, that really was a enlightened a lot of things for me. And I'm glad that I made that transition. And I can remember my high school times, very, very fondly, while I was there.
Do you, looking back at those years, when you after you moved to Rialto and you were in high school, um, do you do you think that was one of the few opportunities in your youth where you were just allowed to be a child?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I was allowed to be a child, but mentally I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
child.
Ironic, huh?
Yes, mentally I wasn't a child, but I was allowed to do the things that children do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we just talked about in this second episode the second half of your first portion of your book. Your book is in three parts. There's the beginning, then there's This Is Life, and then there's the Becoming Dr. Marie.
Mhm.
And I just thank you for being so open and talking about this, because I realize it's not easy,
Mhm.
but it is. I think it's necessary in some ways to help others.
Mhm.
Obviously this is very cathartic for you, but I
Mhm.
also think it helps other people realize that their abnormals are not so uncommon, and
Right.
that they can look at people like you and see the various ways in which you've been able to tap into your resiliency
Mhm.
and flip it and make things, um you know the lemonade, making lemonade. And as tragic as those events in your childhood were,
Mhm.
you became this amazing person. And so I just feel like it's a treasure, one, knowing you and calling you a friend. But I also think it's a gift that you're willing to share with others through your book and through these discussions. So when we come back next time, we're going to hit the second part, This Is Life, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this wonderful memoir,
Mhm.
Getting to My Enough,
Mhm.
from Dr. Marie Brown Mercadel. Thanks for
Thank you
joining us.
so much, Tori. I think for me, one of the last things I want to leave with is that you can heal, and
Yeah.
that we have resilience that's embedded in our soul and in our spirits. And at my weekend sip and heals that I had, it was great being able to hear women be able to have open conversations about their own experiences. Some people who couldn't have open conversations but said, "Hey, can I talk to you later?" But we, as the strong Black women, always have to put on this face. And I learned how to put on this face. I've mastered, putting on this face, even during the times when I wasn't okay. But in being transparent and being open and being authentic, I know a lot of this in my book is hard to absorb. But I want people to know that you can go through the worst of the worst of the worst, and you can still make it. I made it, and you can still make it. Everybody's path is different, and everybody's way of healing is different. But I believe, that we can heal. But it starts first with self-care, acknowledging that our own mental health may be challenged at some time, and then acknowledging that sometimes it's okay to not be okay.
Right. Thank you, Marie.
All right. Thank you so much for listening and watching us.